Welcome to the wonderful fantasy world. Subscribe now. The Mark of the Two Snakes. The Rebirth of the Godslayer. Volume 1. The Awakening of the Blood Oath. Chapter 6. Training of the Blood. Red Eyes. The night wind in the misty wasteland whipped sand and gravel against the caravan tents. Aiden sat by the bonfire made of gear debris, watching as Mara's snake tail swept fine-scale patterns on the metal surface. She coiled herself on a half-buried gear, and the red scales at the base of her tail glimmered faintly in the firelight, echoing the red snake pottery cup hanging from her waist, a sacred object used by Vera in the spiritual vein symbiosis ceremony in Chapter 2 of the Prequel. At this moment, it was gently trembling with her breath. Concentrate. Don't stare at the gears. Mara's voice, mixed with the crackling of the bonfire, was like a snake's tongue skimming over rusty gears. Aiden closed his eyes, but couldn't stop the vision of his blood-red eyes from piercing through his eyelids. In the blood vessels of the human caravan members, silver gear chains were turning with each heartbeat. The numbers like Eternal Silence 23 and Eternal Silence 57 on the chain links were exactly those of the alien spiritual veins devoured in the Eternal Silence disaster in Chapter 7 of the Prequel. Not with your eyes, with your spiritual veins. Mara suddenly whipped her snake tail, and the gear debris suspended in the spiritual vein fluctuations. Aliens can see the shape of spiritual veins, but humans have their hearts and eyes blinded by the gear spell imprints. The red snake spiritual light condensed at her fingertips pierced into the gear, and Aiden saw the flow of spiritual veins inside the metal suddenly become clear, just like the blood-colored pattern his mother left on his palm before her death. When Aiden tried to imitate, a scene from Chapter 2 of the Prequel suddenly flashed in his mind. In the Snake Tribe settlement deep in the misty wasteland, Vera handed the red snake pottery cup to a human, and the spiritual veins in the cup reflected the starry sky. Mara's pottery cup suddenly resonated, and the alien ancient words, symbiosis of blood and gears, at the bottom of the cup became visible in the firelight, creating a faint tremor with the double snake mark on his wrist. Relax. You're not using the gear spell. Imprint. Mara pressed Aiden's trembling wrist. The body temperature under her scales carried the warmth of spiritual veins. Imagine that the spiritual veins are flowing red snakes, the gears are frozen silver snakes, and you are the storm that makes them dance together. The tip of her tail rolled up a gear fragment, and as the spiritual light passed over it, Vera's spiritual vein resonance formula from the previous Divine Throne experiment emerged on the metal surface. Aiden took a deep breath, and blood-colored spiritual light spilled from his palm. His vision suddenly turned black and white, with only the gear spell imprints in humans showing as silver-gray chains, and the spiritual veins of the alien caravan members as beating red snake illusions. When his spiritual light touched the gauntlet of Irewing, the hawk-headed tribe scout, the latter suddenly exclaimed, "There are the pupils of a red snake in your eyes." This was the first time Aiden saw the essence of the spell imprint. The silver gear chains were deeply embedded in the blood vessels of humans, and the church numbers engraved on the chain links were exactly the names of the alien elders siphoned during the Bloodfire Siege in Chapter 4 of the Prequel. He suddenly remembered the gear mold under his father's workbench, which also had the same spell, imprint patterns on the inner side. The chain pattern with which Loren imprisoned Vera's spiritual veins in the previous Divine Throne experiment. Trying to soften the shackles of the gears, Mara handed him a mechanical eye with the WL05 number from the previous Divine Throne experiment engraved on the gear surface, just like Vera softened Loren's mechanical heart back then. The moment Aiden's spiritual light touched the gear, the mechanical eye suddenly projected a scene from Chapter 5 of the Prequel. Vera's snake-headed sword was against Loren's throat, and from the gear gaps of the latter's mechanical prosthesis, red snake patterns of the same color as Aiden's spiritual light seeped out. When the red snake's spiritual light enveloped the gear chain, the groaning of the human merchant suddenly stopped. Aiden opened his eyes and saw a snake-shaped red mark emerging on the merchant's chest, exactly the same as the totem of the snake tribe warriors in Chapter 2 of the Prequel. This is the mark of the self. Repair of the spiritual veins. Mara's voice trembled. The symbiosis seeds planted by Vera with her own blood 100 years ago are now sprouting in you. The bonfire suddenly flickered, and Aiden's jade pendant emitted a faint light. The voice of the remnant soul Vera sounded in his mind. Loren's gear spell, imprint, is both a chain and a bridge. He suddenly realized that the omen of death he saw, the degree of gear fragmentation, was exactly the precursor to the collapse of the spell imprint. When he concentrated, he saw under the scales at the base of Mara's tail, there was a double snake carving identical to that on his mother's coffin. Teach me more. Aiden grabbed Mara's wrist, and the gear-shaped scar under her scales made his pupils contract. It was the mark of the church's gear branding punishment in the previous Divine Throne experiment. But Mara smiled, and the pottery cup spun in her palm, reflecting the red and silver light in Aiden's eyes. First, you have to understand that spiritual veins are not weapons, but songs. She suddenly stood up, and her snake tail slapped the ground, creating vibrations of a specific frequency. The rocks in the misty wasteland cracked in response, and the earth elements condensed into a semi-transparent giant eagle among the gear debris, the spiritual vein guardian beast of the hawk-headed tribe. Aliens don't use gears. We use spiritual veins to communicate with all things. Mara's singing voice rose, mixed with the alien folk songs prohibited in the previous Divine Throne experiment. Just as Vera taught humans, Aiden's blood-red eyes suddenly caught something abnormal. Deep in the gear chain of the human merchant, there was a barely visible red snake pattern. It was the spiritual vein mark left by his mother, exactly the same as the incantation on the remaining pages of the log stolen by his parents in Chapter 11 of the prequel. When he tried to touch it, the merchant suddenly twitched, and the B199 number on the gear chain emitted a harsh resonance. It was the number of the alien youth his father had to protect during the church's purification operation in Chapter 4 of the prequel. Their spiritual veins have been tampered with by the church. Mara handed him a blood-colored leaf, exactly the fallen leaf of the petrified ancient tree. Back then, Loren's siphon cannon not only extracted spiritual veins, but also planted monitoring seeds in the gear spell imprints. Aiden pasted the leaf on the merchant's forehead and saw a fragmented memory. Church soldiers injected a silver-colored liquid with a gear probe, and on the container was printed, "Residual energy of the eternal silence core," for Loren's personal use. In the spiritual light of the blood-colored leaf, Aiden saw a more profound picture. Before Vera was petrified in Chapter 9 of the prequel, she implanted spiritual vein seeds in the misty wasteland, and each leaf recorded the symbiosis ceremonies of the aliens in the previous Divine Throne experiment. When he crushed the leaf and integrated it into the bonfire, the flames condensed into a totem of two snakes entwining, completely opposite to the pattern on the inner side of the inspection team leader's armor in Chapter 1. Now, try to listen with your spiritual veins. Mara pressed the pottery cup against Aiden's chest, and he suddenly heard, among the turning sounds of the gear spell, imprints. There were countless faint wails, the cries for help from the alien spiritual veins devoured in the previous Divine Throne experiment. At a certain moment, he saw both red snake scales and silver snake gears emerging on his palm, just like the energy field projection during the confrontation of the two snakes in Chapter 5 of the prequel. Suddenly, the sound of gear friction came from the periphery of the caravan. Iron-winged steel claws tore through the fog, bringing a human refugee covered in gear-shaped wounds. The church is hunting the unmarked. The refugee tore off his gauntlet, revealing a snake-shaped red mark identical to that of the miner in Chapter 6. They say our blood can make the gears rust, ... Aiden's blood-red eyes activated automatically, and he saw that in the gear cracks above the refugee's head, tiny spiritual vein sprouts were growing. This was the first time he had seen the natural revival of spiritual veins in a human, and the shape of the sprouts was exactly the same as the ancient tree seedlings catalyzed by Vera's blood in Chapter 9 of the prequel. They're afraid we'll regain the ability to sense spiritual veins. The refugee tightly held Aiden's hand, and the calluses on his palm matched the tool marks on his father's workbench. Mara suddenly pressed Aiden's shoulder, and the pottery cup in her hand trembled violently. A church fleet is approaching. Her snake tail rolled up the bonfire, and the red snake's spiritual light outlined the defensive matrix of the previous Divine Throne experiment on the gear debris. Use your blood, red eyes to find their weaknesses. Just like Vera saw through Loren's mechanical heart back then. Aiden closed his eyes, and his blood-colored vision penetrated the mist. On the gear warship 3 kilometers away, numbers like WLO3 and WLO4 were engraved on the inner side of the Church Knight's armors, exactly those of the first batch of human transformants in the previous Divine Throne experiment. When he saw the omen of the captain's death, the moment the gear chain was about to disintegrate, the mechanical eye of the opponent suddenly turned towards the direction of the caravan. They're using the fragmented consciousness of Loren to locate us. Mara's voice was bitter. The blood pattern at the bottom of the pottery cup and Aiden's mark glowed synchronously. Back then, he integrated his consciousness into the core of the Divine Throne. And now the church uses the gear spell, imprints, to herd human fear. She suddenly smashed the pottery cup to the ground, and the shockwave burst out by the red snake's spiritual light was exactly the same as the energy trajectory during the showdown of the two snakes in Chapter 8 of the prequel. Taking this opportunity, Aiden concentrated and depicted the weaknesses of the gear chain in the vision of his blood-red eyes. When he opened his eyes, he found that his fingertips had drawn a pattern of two snakes entwining a gear in the sand. Exactly the same as the mark in the corner of Loren's design drawing in Chapter 3 of the prequel. Mara. He tightly grasped the fragment of the pottery cup. I need you to hold them off with spiritual vein resonance. I'll go cut off the consciousness connection. The aliens in the caravan suddenly formed a circle and ignited a spiritual vein bonfire with the lost symbiosis ceremony from the previous Divine Throne experiment. In the firelight, Aiden saw that their spiritual veins were resonating with the gear ruins, forming a frequency that could interfere with the core of the Divine Throne. This was exactly the symbiosis concept advocated by Vera in Chapter 2 of the prequel, which was now materialized in front of him as a flowing red and silver light net. When the main gun of the church warship was charging, Aiden finally saw the afterimage of Loren's consciousness, the mechanical consciousness left by Loren before the collapse of the Eternal Silence Core in the previous Divine Throne experiment. It parasitized in the resonance frequency of the gear spell, imprints, and obtained energy through the fear and hatred of the believers, just as recorded in the blood-colored incantation on the Eternal Silence Core in Chapter 6 of the prequel. Aiden. Mara's shout penetrated his consciousness. He suddenly woke up and found that his palm was already pressed on the armor of the gear warship, and the red snake's spiritual light was flowing upstream along the opponent's spell imprint chain. In the crevice of consciousness, he saw fragments of Loren's memory. At the top of the gear, Divine Throne in Chapter 5 of the prequel, Loren held Vara's snake, headed sword, and gear, like tears dripped onto the broken spiritual vein crystal. You're just like us, a vessel. Loren's mechanical voice sounded in his mind. The Divine Throne needs anger, needs pain, just as gears need blood for lubrication. But Aiden's blood, red eyes had already seen the truth. Deep in Loren's consciousness, there was the memory of jointly repairing the spiritual vein nodes with Vera. At that time, there were no chain patterns of imprisonment engraved on the gear surface. When the Church Knights came through the fall, Aiden stood in the center of the bonfire. The spiritual veins of the alien caravan members resonated with his mark, dyeing the silver chains of the gear spell imprints red. Those gears that once symbolized slavery now showed the symbiosis incantation from Chapter 2 of the prequel in the spiritual light, shining in response to the mark on Aiden's wrist. They're here. Iron-winged steel claws tore through the fog curtain, and the gear armors of the Church Knights reflected the blood-colored moonlight. Aiden was suddenly inspired and injected the blood-colored spiritual light into his own spell imprint gear, the gear wrench left by his father, with the double snake embryo at the handle absorbing the spiritual vein energy. A miracle happened. The armors of the knights suddenly jammed. and the church numbers on the gear chains began to disintegrate, revealing the alien names hidden beneath. Aiden recognized them as the list of the Snake Tribe elders, whose tribe was destroyed in Chapter 4 of the prequel. What you imprisoned are not aliens. His voice mixed with the crackling of the bonfire, but the symbiosis oaths that should have been heard 100 years ago. Mora's snake tail rolled up the last blood-colored leaf and drew a double snake trajectory under the searchlight of the church fleet. Aiden knew this was just the beginning. When his blood-red eyes first saw clearly the truth under the gear spell imprints, that the spiritual veins of humans and aliens were originally of the same origin, and the so-called racial opposition was just a rusty lie on the core of the divine throne. The bonfire flickered in the mist. Aiden touched the blood pattern on the fragment of the pottery cup, and suddenly understood why Mara insisted on carrying this fragile sacred object. It was not only the ritual token from Chapter 2 of the prequel, but also the spark left by Vera in the long river of time, waiting for a person with the blood of the two snakes like him to reignite the possibility of symbiosis with anger and pity. In the distance, the sound of the gears of the church warship gradually weakened, replaced by the low chanting of the aliens in the caravan, the folk song prohibited in the previous Divine Throne experiment. At this moment, with the fluctuations of the spiritual veins, it was playing the first movement of resistance in the misty wasteland. Aiden knew that his blood-red eyes were no longer just an omen of death, but a metronome that made the gears and spiritual veins resonate. And this piece of music had just begun. This episode ends here. The next episode will be more exciting. Subscribe now.